I had the great fortune and opportunity to be one of the filmmaker photographers documenting the first African American expedition to climb Mount McKinley. Expedition Denali is the name of the climb, and there's going to be a documentary coming out sometime in the middle of June, probably late June. We're kind of working on the final cut. So look for that, and there's actually a promo on my website, which I think Liz gave you the link to. And I got to hang out with this great group of people and climb Denali with camera gear and then bring back photos to tell the adventure. And the photo that I really want to show is sort of the behind-the-scenes shot of this particular image. This is a spot near the 14,000-foot camp called the Edge of the World. And we got stuck in the 14,000-foot camp because there was high winds aloft for about 4 or 5 days. And so I kind of lobbied, let's get the team out to this spot that's supposed to be so spectacular, you know, and just get a little hike in. And in the process of getting some of these images of them in this spectacular spot, we had our film crew kind of rig us up in some precarious positions to hang out and capture images like this where we're sort of dangling over the edge. And this particular image, looking back at our setup, I don't know, it just sort of captures me. I just love the way that it looks. And this is the raw file here in Lightroom, and it's pretty fantastic the way it is, just straight out of the camera. Now, my process for editing an image like this would be, of course, to go into the Develop module. And in the past, before I started using On1 software, I'd really work to get this image as finished as I could in Lightroom before going in and doing a bunch of final edits in Photoshop. But now, with On1, I find myself just sort of basically getting the raw edits. I like to expand, by the way, the right panel in Lightroom. That way I can get a little more control in my sliders. But now I find myself just doing a little bit more basic editing and then finishing the photo in Perfect Effects. So I want to go in here. One of the first things I do when I import an image is I have a particular very light set of settings that I apply to the images, and I make sure that I always light up let's see, lens corrections. I enable default lens corrections, and I make sure that I've checked remove chromatic aberration. Sometimes if you don't remove, not all lenses are equal. If you have a lot of contrast in your scene, sometimes you'll see fringing, color fringing on the edges of high contrast portions of your photograph, and just checking this in Lightroom right at the beginning of your raw image can eliminate a lot of problems down the road. So I always make sure that I've got remove chromatic aberration checked before I even start editing. That's just a sort of a checklist point. Then I would go in here, I look at this image, I've got a great look at my histogram. I think this image could use a little bit more contrast, so I'm going to boost it up just a little bit. And then I would go in, there's really not that much to do in here. It looks pretty great. I maybe take a look with holding the Option key down at setting my black point and my white point. Right about here I can see what's turning black in the image by holding the Option key and dragging this slider. I want to get right to the edge of losing this shadow detail just to get the most contrast I can in the scene without actually losing that much. So right about in here. And then with my whites, I'm going to do the same thing with setting a white point. I'm just going to drag it up, and you can see the snow is starting to kind of blow out here. So I'm going to back it off a bit. Right about there, we've got a nice sort of maxed out contrast in the image. And then I'm going to, Lightroom's a really simple, if I go into this hue, saturation, and luminance panel, I want to take a look at all, so that I have control sliders for hue of the colors, for saturation, and for luminance. And Lightroom has these wonderful targeted adjustment tools. Anytime you see a bullseye, you click on that, you can actually come out into the image and just click in the part of the image you want to affect and drag up or down to increase or decrease that particular color's settings. So here I'm just going to increase the saturation a little bit, just bring my blues out just a touch. Subtle, I don't want to overdo it. And I'm going to darken them a little bit by clicking on the targeted adjustment tool for luminance. I'm going to just pull them down just slightly, just to get a little extra pop in the image. And that's really all I want to do. I don't want to go over the board with adding clarity or vibrance or saturation, because I'm going to work on this image in perfect effects, and that's where I'm going to have a lot more control over fine-tuning those sort of finishing edits. So the next thing I'm going to do is right-click on the image, or control-click for the Mac users, and choose Edit in Perfect Effects 8. And we will edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. I tend to like to work in Pro Photo RGB for a color space. This just gives you more range to work on the image without losing your colors. And I'm going to click Edit. It's going to create a Photoshop document and open it in Perfect Effects. And here we go, lighting it up. And the first filter that I'm going to go to in a scene like this is dynamic contrast. Dynamic contrast is new in Perfect Effects 8, and it's just this marvelous way to get mid-tone contrast and sort of a pop and clarity boost and sharpening all in one place, really, really simply. And at the same time, it gives you a whole lot of control that I've actually never had in any of the methods that I use to boost contrast. I can choose where I want the contrast to be boosted. So in other words, if I zoom in on this image a little bit so that we can see what we're working on, it's got to load the preview here. If I choose to increase the contrast in the small details on this image and drag this slider, you can see it really starts to pop in here, these little details, the crevasses and on the big glaciers on Mount Fork or across the way. It's a little bit too much for me. I'm really not into that crunchy look. You can also pull contrast down. You could sort of get a dreamlike effect. Now in this image, I want just a little bit of popping and contrast in those small details. I generally start, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, I generally start in the natural setting in dynamic contrast. There are other settings. For me, natural tends to kind of fit the realist look that I want in my images. I'm not going for that sort of over-the-top grunge look that a lot of people do like. For me, I really like just a simple, natural kind of look, but I want that pop and contrast. And if I look at what this looks like before and after, it's a dramatic change. It really adds that nice just pop that makes the image stand out. I'm going to also play with how the medium details are rendered, and here we'll see it. If I drag it up, we'll see that these larger details like the rocks and the shadows on the glacier really get just tons of contrast if I drag it up like that. I'm going to come back somewhere, a little bit more, right in there. I like that look. About 25 is working right in there. And then if I go into the large details, you'll see it's really, the edges of his jacket or the edges of the rock, the peak in general. So, again, that's too much for my taste. I'm going to come back somewhere 21, something like that. And that to me looks fantastic. One of the neat things in the dynamic contrast filter is the ability to also sort of darken your highlights a little bit. You can just pull back your highlights just a touch. Like in this case, it's darkening the snow in the scene a little bit. I want to just cut the highlights off the snow just a touch. And you can also boost shadow detail. So here I'm looking to our guide's pants. I can just see that that shadow detail is popping back in there. And in this case, I'd like to get a little more detail in the shadows. And this is just a handy way to get it all in one filter. So now that I've got dynamic contrast really the way that I like the look of, it just looks fantastic to me, I'm going to go and apply a new filter. So here in my filter stack, I'm going to hit the plus button to create another filter on top of my dynamic contrast filter. And I want to just really call attention to the action in this scene, to what's going on, to the rope team, to my friend George over here filming from the other side. And the way to do that for me, I'm going to add a vignette, and I think in this case the Big Softy vignette. It's going to darken the sky, it's going to darken the foreground snow a little bit. It's really going to pull the eye right to the action, to the heart of this image, the peaks in the background, and the action that's happening in the scene. So if I turn it off again, you can just see it's subtle, but it really adds a nice punch to the image. And if we take a look down here in the bottom of Perfect Effects, you can see there's a preview checkbox. This will show what it looks like before we ever started editing this image in Perfect Effects. Yeah, it's a dramatic difference. Bam! Just you hit that, pow! It grabs your attention now. It's a whole new level of detail. And you'll notice that as I pop the contrast up here, we can see some dust specks from the sensor of my camera. That, you know, that's something that's going to happen sometimes, that you may not even be visible before you pull that midtone contrast out with your dynamic contrast filter, and so you may need to do a little more work when we bring it back into Lightroom, which I'm going to do now by clicking apply. So as I click apply, it's going to apply the effect to this Photoshop document, and it's going to save the document and bring it back into Lightroom. And now we've got it sort of sidecard stacked alongside our original. So here's our original image that we worked on in Lightroom, which we thought looked good. But now, you know, after applying some work in Perfect Effects, I have an image that really pops. It just grabs your attention. And I love that. And it was very simple compared to the way that I used to edit in Photoshop. This is a piece of cake. And I had a higher level of control over how the effect was applied. Now in Lightroom, because we've got these dust specks popping up, I'm going to come in here to 1:1, and I'm not going to do this all right now. By holding the space bar, I can get the hand to drag around, and you can see there's a dust speck right there. I can click on my dust and scratch removal tool, snap on it, and, well, now Lightroom's doing a poor job for some reason. I don't know. I'm going to hit Control Z, which is undoes the last move that I did. I'm sorry, Control Z for the PC and Command Z for the Mac. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller with the left bracket key, and there we go. Just go through and remove all these specks. You're going to scroll around the screen. You see a speck, remove it. Wow, for some reason, oh, you know what it is? For some reason, this system was set up under clone. So when you're using the spot edit tool, there's clone and there's heal. We did not want to clone, we wanted to heal. So I'm hitting Command Z or Control Z for the PC. I'm switching it to heal, and now you're going to see those specks just disappear like magic. There's another one. Boom. It's just like magic. Lightroom does a really great job of this. And so I would go through the entire image and get rid of all those. I'm not going to bore everybody with that right now. But so there you have it. Before, after. The next image that I want to talk about is from a day of shooting that I did back in 2012 in the desert Southwest. These images were all taken in one day down around the border of Utah and Arizona. And I was fortunate enough to go out and photograph some of the condors, California condors, that have been released into the wild in Utah. And there are only 2 populations of these in the United States. They had gone completely extinct, and then the San Diego Zoo had a captive breeding program. They'd gone completely extinct in the wild, and the San Diego Zoo got a captive breeding program going and reintroduced them to the wild. And I was fortunate enough to get in really close with a long lens and get some really beautiful images of this bird that they've reintroduced to the wild. They're just magnificent. And then towards the end of that day, I got in and went into Horseshoe Bend on the Colorado River and just had a magnificent sunset there. This is an image that I'm really proud of. And in the middle of the day, we spent that heat of the day part going into Antelope Canyon, which, you know, everybody who loves landscape photography has seen lots of images of these slot canyons in northern Arizona near Page. And it cracked me up that we parked the car to go into Little Antelope Canyon in this spot right by this giant power production plant that was just so stark in this desert landscape. So it was a great day photographically. It was a really exciting little adventure day. And you know, you go into the slot canyons, and I see so many images like this. It's a beautiful place. The light in the heat of the day comes down and filters through the canyon. And you get these magnificent colors and tones. But you know, they're images that we've all seen over and over again. And I really wanted to create something kind of different. So I went in and I was sort of snooping around trying to find a new composition, and I looked up and I saw these just tremendous shapes looking straight up through this one portion of the slot canyon. And I knew that the camera sensor isn't capable of seeing as much dynamic range as the human eye. So I could see blue sky in this image and all the colors in the rock. And I loved this composition, and I thought, you know, maybe I'll shoot a bracketed series of images from capturing the detail of the canyon walls all the way up to capturing the blue of the sky up above, and find some way to blend those in Photoshop. I'm not a big HDR guy, but back in 2010 when I shot these, or 2000, is it 2010? I guess these were 2010. Back then, I was thinking more of compositing them in Photoshop, you know, layering them and sort of painting the shadow detail in. And, you know, I didn't do much with it. I was just very busy in between then and now. And then I was using ON1's Perfect Photo Suite 8, and I was going back looking at some of the images that I need to edit and looking at it with a new eye using Perfect Effects. And I came to this particular image, and I thought, you know, with the sensors the way they are, I wonder if there's enough in one of these images just to work a single image and get the look that I want from this canyon with the sky. And so I started looking. The first step for me in seeing if there's enough dynamic range to capture everything in one shot and really edit it down is to grab the exposure slider in Lightroom. And if I drag it to the left, I can sort of see, you know, what does the sky look like if I underexpose as far as I can for the entire image in Lightroom. And I see, well, this image, the sky is really kind of gray. It didn't have, it's too overexposed for the sky to capture any detail. So let's look at the next image in my bracketed series and drag my slider over. Well, there's the one. And in this case, I want to get the brightest exposed image possible, because as you can see, as I drag this up, we start to see that there's some noise as I pull the extreme shadow detail out of here. You know, there's only so far you can go without introducing noise in the image. Even though I shot this, I was using a D700 back at the time, and I shot it at ISO 200. There's still, you know, there's still going to be noise when you boost shadows that much. So I decided I would edit this as far as I could in Lightroom and give Perfect Effects a shot at getting the final image that I want. And so, you know, again, the first thing I do is I make sure I've got my, you know, and this is an interesting thing. When you're working in Lightroom, sometimes it gets really tedious to scroll through all these panels that you've opened and closed. And if you control click for the Mac, or right click, or command, or yeah, just right click for the PC or control click for the Mac and choose solo mode, it actually closes it down to where only one panel opens at a time, and it's a lot easier to move around. Now, if I come down here to lens corrections, it'll close everything but the panel that I'm working in. So solo mode is a nice way to move around a little bit faster in Lightroom. So I just make sure I've got remove chromatic aberration checked, and that's extremely important in an image like this where you've got so much contrast. It'd be very easy to get chromatic aberration and color fringing on these edges with all the contrast. So that's done. I'm going to go back into my basic edits in Lightroom, and I want to get this as close to finished as I can in Lightroom, working with the raw file, because the raw file is going to have more latitude for adjustments than the Photoshop document that we're going to create to edit in Perfect Effects. So in this case, I look at this and I say there's so much contrast in this scene, it's really obvious to me that I need to reduce it pretty dramatically. So I'm going to pull the contrast slider back to where I start to see some more shadow detail. And I'm going to pull it quite a ways back, probably down somewhere in here. I'm starting to see the detail that I want in the shadows. I'm going to take a look at my white and black point. Lightroom's pretty much built to go down these edit pieces one by one, you know, in order, but I tend to like to focus on the white and black points before highlights and shadows. It's the one place where I kind of deviate and go out of order. So I'm going to take a look. I'm sure that the white point I probably don't want to adjust because it's already on the edge, as you can see. Even I might want to pull back a little bit because we're starting to lose the edges of the sky and the rock right there. But the blacks, I think the black point could probably, oh, see, we've already blown it a little bit. I'm going to bring the black point up and recapture some of that shadow detail that's missing. And I'm actually going to, yeah, I don't care if I lose a little bit. I like the haunted look of the dark shadows, but maybe right about there. I don't want to lose too much detail in the shadows. And then, once again, I'm going to drag the highlights and shadows around now. So I'm going to back up from setting my white and my black point. I'm going to pull highlights down a little bit to recover this sky, because the highlights are working on this particular part of our histogram, which is not the pure white part of the histogram, but in here in sort of the 3/4 tones. And I'm just going to drag that down to where I get a nice looking blue without overdoing it. And then shadows, I'm going to start boosting those shadows to pull some of the detail back that we wanted in the edges. And wow, this image is already starting to look pretty fantastic. I can't wait to see what we can do with perfect effects with it. So having done all that, I might come down here into hue, saturation, and luminance. You start to see sort of a method to my madness. I tend to be repetitive in my process. And I'm going to just play with the blue saturation a little bit. I'm going to boost it just a little. Not too much, but just a little bit. And I'm going to make it a little bit darker with the targeted adjustment tools again. It's really such a nice feature. You just hover over the color that you want to change, click and drag your mouse up or down to change the luminance or the saturation or even the hue, the color itself. We don't need to mess with that here. And when you're done, you just click done, and that closes the targeted adjustment tool. And then in this image, I know I have a noise problem, and I would rather work on that noise problem in Lightroom on the raw file than on the file that I'm going to process in Perfect Effects, because you have more latitude to work with noise and with sharpening in the raw file, in your raw editor, than you do in a Photoshop document or a TIFF file after you've edited in other software. So in this case, I'm going to come down here to detail. Detail is where I've got my sharpening and my noise reduction. And in this image, I've gone through and done a little bit of sharpening in advance. And sharpening is really a bit of an art form. It's kind of like seasoning a fine gourmet meal. It's a topic for a larger discussion than just an hour webinar on how to edit travel photos. But sharpening and noise reduction are slightly interrelated, and it's definitely worth getting all the image quality that you can from your image by learning more about sharpening. In this case, the noise reduction element is the really important piece for me in this image. And I'm going to hold down the Option key again, just like I did when I was setting my black and my white point. And I'm going to drag this luminance slider. Holding the Option key down is going to remove the color, because there's two types of noise in these images. One is color noise, and the other is just noise in the image itself, the underlying image in the tone. And we're really only working with this luminance noise reduction, it's luminance noise, to get rid of this. And if we're looking at it in color, the color noise can actually throw us off. You see there still appears to be some sort of reddish noise in here. And the color noise is a whole nother slider down below. So we can eliminate that and really only work on the luminance noise by holding that Option key down and sliding it until it starts to look pretty clean. And I'm going to go pretty aggressively here. I'm going to come all the way up to about 44 or so, I think. Well, right in there. I want to make sure that I get rid of the noise as much as I can. And then I'm going to also adjust my color slider, my color noise slider, and I'm going to try to get rid of this color noise or this chroma noise in the shadows and really clean those up a bit. So I'm going to boost that quite a bit. And I'm really, I'm not caring about the numbers on my slider as much as just watching these shadows and seeing that noise disappear. And now, Lightroom has this neat feature where you can toggle your work on and off in each of these panels. I'm going to show what it looked like before we did this. So let's turn the detail work that we just did off. That's a huge difference. We've gotten rid of the luminance noise and the chroma noise. So now I think we're pretty much ready to take this image into Perfect Effects and work on it, finishing it. And I really do. I think of Perfect Effects. I think of Lightroom as my raw editor and Perfect Effects as my finishing touches. It's where I really put the pop and the pizzazz in the image that makes it catch people's eyes. So I'm right-clicking on the image or control-clicking on the Mac, and I'm choosing Edit in Perfect Effects 8. And once again, I'm going to create a PSD. We could also choose a JPEG or a TIFF. I'm going to use a PSD with Adobe ProPhoto RGB, the widest color space possible, and open it up. And it's preparing the file. And here we go. Cool, we got it. So now looking over here at the filter stack again, I've got an empty filter, and I'm going to once again, instead of starting off with dynamic contrast in this image, what I really want is to pull shadow detail without losing my highlights. And a great filter for that within Perfect Effects is the HDR look filter. And as you can see, we could hit surreal, and that's really not what I'm going for. I like the shadow. I like the natural look of it. So once again, just like when I'm using dynamic contrast, my tendency is to start out with natural. And you know, even this is adding a little bit more shadow detail than I might want in the image, and that's where these filter options come into play. In this case, I want to just play with this compression slider. That's where we're going to see if I pull it up, we're going to get a lot more detail in the shadows without losing our highlights. If I pull it down, it's a lot less. In this case, I'm just going to kind of get it to this. I want a mysterious look to the shadows, but I want detail in them. I don't want to overdo the effect. I want it right there. And this filter also lets us add clarity. It lets us add vibrance, which is, you know, the color saturation. If we played with that, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it alone. I kind of like the effect. I like the look of this image just as it is. And I do want to, I'm going to go back to 10, which is sort of the default for natural. But I am going to do some more filters where I have fine-tuned control over how I add detail and how I add a little bit of glow to this image. That I do want to enhance the glow down in here, but I'll show you how I do that next. That's going to be by adding other filters. So I'm going to add another filter to the stack by pushing the plus button over here in the filter stack panel. I'm going to close down the HDR look and choose instead to go into dynamic contrast. And there's very few images, you know, maybe portraits, but there are a few others where I'm not excited about using dynamic contrast because it gives me the ability to get that pop, that contrast in different portions of the image with the control over what size details I'm adding it to versus it just gives me this huge level of control. So once again, I'm going to hit natural, and it feels a little much for me right now, you know, between the HDR look and this filter in conjunction. So I may pull the medium details down just a little bit. I like the large details having the contrast. I think that's starting to look really nice at this point. So we can see before and after, it just gives this level of pop and clarity, a little bit of sharpening. It just does a whole lot for this image. It's giving it a little bit more of just a pizzazz. It's like bam, there you've got dynamic contrast. Dynamic contrast is my BAM filter. I just love it. And then I want to work just a little bit. I'm going to zoom in, and I've gotten a lot of detail back in these sunlit rocks up above. It's actually the top of the canyon, and it's taken it a moment to render this. But I'm gonna play with one more fun filter in here that ON1's provided us in the adjustment brushes. And I'm going to go in here and choose Recover Highlights right here. And what this does is it applies a filter that increases the detail and highlights. You'll see what it does in a second. But it throws a black mask over the whole thing. And then I'm going to choose my brush, which is already selected for you here, and I'm going to paint in detail back into these highlights. And I'm going to use the perfect brush, which will keep me from accidentally painting into the sky if I go over the edges. So when I paint with the perfect brush, it's only going to apply the effect where I don't move the crosshair over the line. So there's a distinct line here between this brightly sunlit rock and the sky and the shadowed rock. And as long as I keep this little crosshair in the center of my brush from going over that edge, we're golden, just like the rock. And you can see it's very subtle, but if I was printing this large, that will make a difference to have that little bit less blown out right there. It's not as dramatic as maybe I might hope, but that's because I'm really pushing this image to the edge with having the dynamic range possible in a single image. I mean, from the brightest of sunlit highlights to the deepest shadows of this canyon, it's pretty amazing that our digital sensors are letting us have this level of detail in a raw file to begin with. So I'm just painting that into those little spots. And let me show you, if I didn't have the perfect brush and I started doing this, you can see it's just impossible. You start hitting the sky and everything changes. Now I'm going to hit Command Z or Control Z on the PC to undo that. Another option would be to go up here and hit Edit, Undo. You can see it shows you the shortcut key. And so, you know, it's subtle, but I like the effect. Actually, you can see it a little bit better on this rock. This is really nitpicky, but I love to make really big prints of my images, and it really does. Sometimes when you print an image 24 by 36 and then you look at it, you notice the little details that you missed, and you think, oh geez, I just wasted that much ink and paper, and I really needed to touch up that one small spot. So the final little job that I want to do here is I want to add some warmth into these shadows here, and the way that I'm going to do that is with the color enhancer, and I'm going to choose that. I'm going to add that a new filter. Don't forget that you have to add a new filter, or else you're just going to change your adjustment brush to a new filter. So I'm clicking plus here. I'm going to come over here into my filter panel, and I'm looking for warmer. I might have missed it at the top. No, I'm looking for warmer. They go in order, so there we go. Wow, way too much, and this looks awful. So some people might just skip it. But I do want to warm up the shadows right here in this particular part of the image. So one of the great things that ON1 provides with these filters are blending options, and I think a lot of people miss this, but if you click right here, there's this neat eyedropper, and I can say I really want to apply this preferentially to tones in this region of the image, and with one click, you know, it's still not great. It's just way too much at this point. But it's targeting the part of the image that I really want to work on. Now I'm going to drop the temperature here dramatically. I don't want it to be that warm. It's interesting. It seems to be brightening the image. Let me see here. There we go. I've had this interesting thing happening lately, and I'm going to talk to the folks from ON1 here. Sometimes if I get too many filters in the stack, it'll brighten the whole image when I add a filter, and that's really, it's an interesting thing. But I find that if I drag it down into the stack one lower and then put it back up, and it's important to click on the image and drag it and not the mask, otherwise you'll move the masks around. So you want to grab the image, drag it down, drag it back up. It fixes the entire problem. So now we're not brightening the image, and we're getting just the look that we want here. And I'm gonna play with the temperature just a little bit. I actually want a little more now that I'm seeing the filter in it the way that I want it. You know, it's subtle. Now I don't necessarily like the effect up here in the upper rocks in the sky. So I'm going to use that same. I'm going to grab our brush here, and let's get out of our filter options and up here, scroll up to where we can see the mask that's applied here. I'm going to use this wonderful masking option in the filter stack to paint out the effect, maybe 90% opacity on my paintbrush. I'm going to click on the perfect brush option. Actually, I'm not going to click on the perfect brush option. Yes, I am. I'm going to paint it just out of the sky first. And I'm going to use the bracket keys on my keyboard to increase the brush size. I could also increase the brush size by dragging up here. I can choose, to make my brush bigger and smaller. But the bracket keys work very well for that too on the keyboard. So I can just increase and decrease. And I'm just going to paint, the effect out of these upper rocks a bit. It's a little too red for me, and out of the sky. I like it in there. I'm using the perfect brush. I'm probably not going to get into those shadow details in the upper part of the image. So there you can see it. What I've drawn out on the mask is essentially this brightest part of the image that I don't want to warm up as much because it's already warm. And so I feel like this image is fantastic. It's exactly what I was looking for. When I go back and I look at, we had it great in Lightroom. If I turn off our on-one perfect effect filters, you can see it looked great in Lightroom, but look at how fantastic it is now. The HDR look, the dynamic contrast, the recovering highlights with the adjustment brush, and then adding a little bit of warmth in the shadows. I just love it. I'm going to hit apply, and it's going to throw it back into Lightroom. So I guess the overarching point of this all is that since I have started using perfect effects for my finishing of my images, it's so much faster, and I have a whole lot more control over how I'm editing my images than I did in Photoshop. In Photoshop, I was able to get the look that I wanted in my images, but I spent a lot more time doing it. It was less intuitive, and in cases like dynamic contrast, I didn't have as much control over which portions of the image I was adjusting versus other portions of the image. So with On1's Perfect Photo Suite 8, I find myself spending a lot less time editing, getting the images edited in ways that are better than I used to, and spending more time out traveling, adventuring, and getting more travel photographs to bring home and edit, which is what it's really all about for me. I did have one more image that I wanted to talk about editing, and I'm afraid I'm kind of running out of time. We may have to do it another time, but just last week I was in South Padre Island, Texas, doing sort of a kiteboarding trip and also a commercial wine shoot. I kind of combined one with the other. I'm working on an article about kiteboarding. My wife and I have gotten into this sport in the last couple of years, and it's just a fabulous sport with a wonderful culture. It's a lot of fun. It's great to photograph because there's lots of bright colors and action, and it has this wonderful community, and it's kind of funny. I'm often talking to people about it, and they have no real concept of what kiteboarding really is. They picture, a Ben Franklin kite, and they kind of understand that people use wakeboards and surfboards, but where the connection comes together is a whole nother thing. So I kind of tasked myself with finding some images on this trip that would showcase exactly what kiteboarding really is and is like, from helping each other to launch these big kites and giving a sense of scale, how big they are, to how you walk out into the water with your board and power up and take off riding. And it's this wonderful combination of board sports and sailing and flying kites and camaraderie, and it's a sport that people seem to be doing from their 20s to their 70s, and it's just a lot of fun. So I got out there and I made some great images of kiteboarding, had a lot of fun kiteboarding, and at the same time was able to take this trip with my friends up further north up the island into these dunes and shoot some wine for a wine distributor client of mine in San Francisco who wanted some French wine shot with sand dunes in the background. They're from Provence in France, where there's lots of dunes. And so, the group of us went out, we had a good time, we drank some wine, we shot some wine, and sort of by the time I dialed in on the shot that I really thought the client wanted, after working with the art director on what they wanted, the light just was not that great. And really the whole time that we were in South Padre, the light wasn't fantastic at sunset. I didn't get these great sunsets because there was kind of a haze over the horizon. And so every night I'd be excited about going out to shoot the wine, and it'd be kind of flat. And it started to get towards the end of the trip, and everybody really wanted to drink the wine. And so we just decided we'd go out and do it. And at this point, knowing what I can do with On1 software and Lightroom after I'm done photographing, I got this composition in this image, and I realized, you know, just using On1's perfect effects, I would be able to finish the image in a way that my client loved. And you know, maybe another time we can do another webinar, or I can do a perfect inspiration episode for you guys or something, and talk a little bit about how we went from just this flat light image to really sort of creating a lighted sunset image with this bottle of wine. And my client absolutely loved it. So I guess with that, I'll ask Liz if there's anybody that has, you know, some. I know she's been taking questions, but I wonder if there's any that she wants to kind of pop up and highlight before the end of the hour.
We had a whole bunch of really good questions in here today, but a lot of them relate back to the camera and the lenses that you use on your shoots. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk just a little bit about some of the equipment that you're using to take these pictures.
Absolutely. So ever since I got started as a professional photographer, I've been sort of obsessed with image quality. And back in the day, I started out shooting 35 millimeter slide film, and then I moved through medium format film to large format film, which Liz and I were talking about. She still shoots with a 4x5 today, which I really credit her with. It's such an artistic form. Today, I'm shooting with a Nikon D800, which has that excellent Sony 36 megapixel sensor, and the dynamic range that that camera produces is just mind-bending. I absolutely love it. I think the Sony A7 and R actually has about that same sensor, and I use Nikon's Pro Glass most of the time. I'm pretty sure this image I was shooting with my 70-200 VR2, and some of these older images that I worked on today, let me go into the grid mode, which you can always hit the button G or press this in Lightroom, press this grid icon. Some of the older images, this is shot with my old D700. You know, it's only 12 megapixels, but I have printed this image 24 by 36, and as long as you get a nice sharp image with good glass, it's amazing how much you can increase the resolution of it. Some of the images that I work on lately, I get so obsessed with high resolution because I want to make giant prints. This image for Expedition Denali is actually a 360-degree image. If you look, these people standing over here are these people standing over here, and these bags are these bags. And this is made up out of 18 D800 images. So it's a panoramic merger that is nearly 300 megapixels. So I shoot mainly with Nikon gear. I've used Canon gear. I think Canon and Nikon are both excellent systems. I tend to use fast glass just because it tends to be the better glass that the camera companies are making.
There were also a couple of questions for you about noise reduction. When you were showing off the noise reduction in your, I believe it was the Southwest image, and you were
Yep.
talking about that. Do you go through and apply automatic noise reduction on most of your images, or do you go through and do it individually on each different photo?
You know, it really depends. I'm gonna go back to, let me go into the grid. It depends on the image. When we went into this image in Alaska and we worked on it, I always do let Lightroom apply its default noise reduction. It does a really good job in general. So if we go into detail here, we take a look. This image, Lightroom chose to apply no noise reduction to. As I zoom in here and look in the shadows, you know, this was shot with my D800 at ISO 100 in bright daylight. It's exposed. We didn't have to boost the shadows at all in post-processing. There's just no noise in this image. So in this case, no, I'm not going to do anything with noise reduction. When it comes to an image like the image that we worked on in the Slot Canyon, I'm going to go back into my grid view with hitting the G key. Oops. We might have just lost our keyboard. I'm going to go into library. When I go into that slot canyon image, we boosted its um, we boosted its shadows so much that even though it was shot at 200 ISO with a really good camera, a D700, that's one of the cleanest low noise cameras ever made, unless we boosted this noise reduction, you can see there's a lot of noise, color noise and luminance noise. So it just really is image specific. I'm going to take a look in the shadows and decide whether I'm going to do it manually or not. I guess that's the answer to the question. Once I'm getting through the basic edits in Lightroom, I'm just going to zoom into some of the shadowy parts of my image and say, wow, I think that needs some noise work before I take it into Perfect Effects for finishing. Because I'd rather do that noise reduction work in RAW if I possibly can, because there's just more latitude to do it.
There were a couple of questions in here about specifically, again, with this Southwest image. Do you ever take multiple exposures and go through and combine them together, or do you prefer to kind of work with an image that's under overexposed and then recover the information that the camera's already recorded with your raw file? Do you have a preferred method of getting the information, the most information you can out of these photos?
That's such a great question. And as you know, coming from film, in the old days, I shot film, scanned it, and would work on the images. Back before people were doing HDR, I would take multiple exposures, scan them, and combine them in Photoshop. I'd put them on two separate layers and then use a soft brush and paint the shadows into an image that has the highlights properly exposed. And I was really thinking that this is an image back when I hadn't had the D700 that long, back in 2010. It was still a new camera, and I wasn't sure what the dynamic range capability of the camera was. It was still relatively new to me. So I did, as you can see, I shot for the shadows. Then I bracketed, this one obviously we've edited. The sky wasn't visible in it before. And I kept going right up until I had an image that was just the sky. So I knew I really liked the image, and I knew I might need to go into Photoshop and edit. I'm not really an HDR guy, so I tend to do those kinds of things by hand and keep them as natural looking as possible. I really wanted an image that looks just like what we just pulled out of On One. I wanted this particular image. And I love being able to do it in a single image. With the noise reduction, with the great new sensors that we have, particularly the latest generation of sensors. The camera that I'm using the most, the D800, blows my mind how much dynamic range is in those raw files. You won't see it on the back of the camera, but you come home and pull those basic sliders and have a look, and it's just amazing how much detail is there. And here's another example. This is Horseshoe Bend. This is the original raw file. And when I drag that, you see the whole sky is there, except for maybe just a little bit in these clouds, which is not unacceptable to me. And there's just plenty of range in there. So if I can do it in a single image, I would much rather do it in a single image. If I'm going to sacrifice image quality in order to do that, then whoa, didn't mean to do that. Then I'll definitely work on compositing an image, and maybe that's another discussion for later. But On One has the perfect layers where you can work on that kind of thing too.
One of the last questions that I have for you, and this is one that it's kind of a general question because there were a lot of people who were wondering about your printing process. And I know Hudson, so it's not like we've just met today. I actually know Hudson pretty well, and I know that he prints a lot of his images. And I was actually wondering if you could tell them just a little bit in the next couple of minutes about you processing your photos for print and kind of why you do that. There were quite a few questions about why you used ProPhoto RGB or over sRGB and Adobe RGB 1998, and then also whether you print from Lightroom or Photoshop or where you prefer your sharpening. So I know it's quite a few questions, but maybe you could just give a couple of tips or maybe a couple of ideas behind how you prep your images for print, because a lot of people were really curious about that.
All right, yeah. Actually, the thing I love making big prints in my images, and This one, after I went in and edited it, gosh, it's probably been a few months ago when I was first playing with Perfect Suite 8. I printed big, and I have up in several commercial spaces in Portland at 24 by 36. Even though it's only a 12 megapixel image, it looks fantastic printed big. And so my process, uh, I shoot in RAW, and then as I edit, I have all my settings in Lightroom to use ProPhoto RGB. If I work on it in Photoshop or in Perfect Effects, I like to keep it in ProPhoto RGB. And the reason for that is that ProPhoto RGB is an extremely wide color space. It's about the biggest, widest possible color space. So if you bring an image in RAW into a smaller color space, because smaller color space can look fantastic for production on the web, or sending an email photo. It's got lots of vibrance and pop, and the internet is built around sRGB, but it's a very narrow color space. And if you go editing in that, you can wind up clipping color information that's just lost forever in your image. That you can if you edit it in ProPhoto RGB, and I would rate Adobe 1998 as sort of in between sRGB and ProPhoto. If you edit in ProPhoto, you're not going to lose any color information as you edit, and then you can convert it to sRGB when you export JPEGs for the web or for Facebook or for email, and they'll still look fantastic when you send out those smaller exports. But if you're going to print your images, printers have even they're looking at a different color gamut than your editing software on your screen. So you just want to keep that as broad as possible, and that's why I use ProPhoto RGB. My process for printing is to develop in Lightroom, finish the image, develop the raw file in Lightroom, finish the image in ON1's Perfect Effects. Sometimes I use Perfect Resize to get a little bit more resolution out of an image like this that I want to print big, like 24 by 36. Perfect Resize is magnificent at that, and I'd love to do a little webinar about how you do that at another point. And then I come in here and I use Lightroom soft proofing. Lightroom 5 has built-in soft proofing, and I'm not on my home system, so I don't have all my profiles here, but I would click on this. Up here will come up a panel about soft proofing, and I would choose what my profile for the printer and paper that I'm using is, and it will simulate the color of the paper, and it'll simulate what the print's going to look like on that paper, and I will choose to see the image before and after, maybe a top and bottom, and I'll edit what it looked like before. I'll edit a proof copy to get it looking like I had edited it on the paper and ink that I'm using, and then I'll send a small test print out of Lightroom. I always print out of Lightroom. I think Lightroom's printing engine is just magnificent. It's far more intuitive and easy to use and understand than Photoshop's ever was. I used to print a lot out of Photoshop, and I applaud Lightroom for being such a nice, easy to use print engine. And I'll send some test prints out and just tweak and adjust till I get a smaller print looking like what I want, and then I'll pull the trigger and print it big.
Well, that was awesome, Hudson. That was really, really fun. We are just a few minutes after noon here on the Pacific Coast, so unfortunately we're going to have to head out. But thanks for coming out today, Hudson. This was an awesome webinar. A lot of people seem to really, really enjoy it. And thanks for answering questions at the end. That was really nice.
Thanks so much to everybody for logging in, and thanks to Liz and ON1 for having me. It was a pleasure.
Don't forget, you guys, before I exit, I want to remind you, if you're interested, jump over to the chat panel, and there will be Hudson's website on there so that you can take a look at his photography. And then if you have any other questions for us, just visit on1software.com, jump over to that support and training tab, and contact our customer support if you're running into any issues. We do keep up a webinar schedule for about 2 weeks, so if you are interested in learning a little bit more about the suite in this kind of long-form, class-based way, that webinar schedule is updated every single week. So you guys can really plan out time to come and watch these, which, as you can tell, you can learn quite a bit. Stuff that you didn't know about Lightroom, about the photo suite, and about photography. So with that, we are going to let you go. But thanks again, you guys, for all showing up today. Hopefully we will see some of you in future webinars, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks so much.